What avoidants secretly expect during no contact. Let's get real. When someone pulls away, when they go into no contact, what's really happening? Some say they don't care. Some say they've moved on. But here's the truth. Avoidants have expectations, even if they won't admit it. They don't just vanish into thin air emotionally. They expect you to chase. That's right. When they withdraw, they subconsciously anticipate that you'll break the silence. They want the reassurance without the responsibility. They want the validation without the vulnerability. But here's what they don't see coming. When you hold the line, when you resist the urge to run after them, something shifts because suddenly their expectation isn't met. And that discomfort, that's where real change happens. You see, an avoidant doesn't respond to words. They respond to patterns. If your pattern has been to reach, to fix, to close the gap, then breaking that pattern is the most powerful thing you can do. It forces them to face what they've been avoiding. When an avoidant pulls away, it's easy to assume they've moved on without a second thought. Their demeanor may seem cold, distant, and uninterested, reinforcing the belief that they are completely detached. But beneath the surface, avoidants have deeply ingrained expectations about how others will respond to their withdrawal. The key thing to understand is that avoidants expect you to chase. They have spent much of their lives navigating relationships in a way that protects them from deep emotional intimacy, and one of the ways they maintain this control is by creating distance, consciously or unconsciously anticipating that the other person will close the gap. This expectation is rooted in their attachment style. Avoidants have learned through past experiences, often from childhood, that emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, suffocating, or even unsafe. They may crave connection on a deep level, but their defense mechanisms make intimacy feel like a threat. So when they feel a relationship becoming too emotionally intense or requiring more vulnerability than they are comfortable with, they instinctively create space. This doesn't necessarily mean they want to lose the connection, but rather they want to regulate their emotions by pulling back. However, the key is that they don't expect this distance to be permanent. Instead, they subconsciously believe that their withdrawal will trigger a predictable reaction, you reaching out to them, trying to reestablish the connection. This is the pattern that has reinforced their behavior time and time again. If every time they pull away, someone chases after them, they never have to confront their fear of intimacy directly. They get the reassurance of knowing the other person is still there without having to actively engage or take emotional risks. This dynamic plays out repeatedly in relationships with avoidants. When they pull away and their partner reaches out in distress, sending texts, asking for closure, or trying to talk things out, the avoidant's belief that relationships operate this way is validated. It strengthens their perception that they are the ones in control of closeness and distance, and that emotional security will always come from the other person making the effort. They may even find relief in knowing that they are still wanted, but they rarely acknowledge this consciously. Instead, they may frame their partner's reaction as being needy or too much, further justifying their avoidance. Now, what happens when this expectation is not met? When the person they assume will chase them suddenly doesn't? When they are met with silence instead of pursuit? This is where things get interesting. An avoidant who expects a certain response will be thrown off when the dynamic shifts. At first, they may feel justified in their distance, assuming it was the right move. But as time passes and they don't receive the expected reassurance, doubt begins to creep in. They may start wondering why you haven't reached out, questioning whether you've moved on, and even experiencing discomfort in the absence of your presence. This discomfort is crucial because it forces them to sit with emotions they usually push away. For the first time, they might have to consider that they are not in control of the relationship dynamic and that emotional security is not something that is guaranteed without effort. They may begin to miss the connection in ways they didn't anticipate, leading them to reflect on their actions and their deeper fears about intimacy. By not chasing, you are disrupting the avoidant subconscious belief that relationships work in a one-sided manner. You are breaking a pattern that has been ingrained in them for years, and in doing so, you are creating space for true emotional awareness to develop. Whether or not they act on this realization is up to them, but the fundamental shift happens when their expectation of being pursued is not fulfilled. Avoidants are not moved by words alone. They respond to patterns, behaviors, and experiences. This is because their defense mechanisms are deeply ingrained and often operate at a subconscious level. They have learned to protect themselves from emotional vulnerability by creating distance, and over time they have built a mental framework that reinforces this pattern. If they have experienced relationships where they pull away and the other person consistently reaches out, apologizes, or tries to mend the connection, this reinforces their belief that closeness is something they can control, something that will always be available to them without them needing to actively engage. This is why breaking a pattern is so powerful. An avoidant isn't likely to have an aha moment just because you tell them that their behavior is hurtful or that they are pushing love away. They may intellectually understand what you're saying, but understanding is different from internalizing. The only way they internalize change is through experience. If they expect you to react in a certain way and you don't, it disrupts their narrative. This disruption forces them to reconsider their beliefs, not because they are consciously choosing to, but because their mind no longer has the predictable reinforcement it relies on. For example, if every time an avoidant withdraws, you reach out with long messages expressing your feelings, they come to expect this. Even if they find it overwhelming or frustrating, it is still familiar. But if one day they pull away and you do nothing, no text, no call, no attempt to reestablish connection, it shakes their internal assumptions. It creates uncertainty where certainty once existed. They start to question whether they truly have control over the situation. They may wonder if you have moved on, if you no longer care, or if they misjudge your attachment to them. This discomfort is the catalyst for change. Avoidants often rely on distancing behaviors as a way to manage their emotions, but when that strategy doesn't produce the expected results, they are forced to sit with their feelings in a new way. They might experience loneliness or a sense of loss that they weren't prepared for. More importantly, they have to acknowledge that the dynamic they were accustomed to no longer exists. They may start to reflect on whether their avoidance is truly serving them or if they are pushing away people who actually care about them. This process is not about manipulation. It is about self-respect and recognizing that constantly chasing someone who avoids intimacy does not lead to a healthy relationship. It is about breaking a cycle that is unsustainable and unfulfilling. The only way to shift the dynamic with an avoidant is by changing how you respond to their distancing behaviors. If they do not receive the validation or reassurance they expect, they must either adjust their approach or face the consequences of emotional disconnection. This is why actions matter more than words. You can tell an avoidant that you are tired of being the only one putting in effort, but if you continue to pursue them when they pull away, they will not believe you. However, if you show them that you will no longer engage in that pattern, they have no choice but to recognize the shift. Whether they choose to acknowledge it openly or not, they will feel it. In relationships, we teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate and how we respond to their behavior. If an avoidant learns that they can always retreat and you will always be there waiting, they have no reason to change. But if they learn that distance does not guarantee your presence, they are faced with a reality they were not expecting. This forces them to confront their own fears and reconsider their approach to connection. Silence is one of the most powerful tools in human interaction, and it becomes especially significant when dealing with avoidant individuals. When an avoidant pulls away, they expect the other person to close the gap. They assume that their withdrawal will create anxiety, prompting the other person to reach out, seek reassurance, and reestablish the connection. And this expectation is not necessarily something they consciously think about. It is simply how their attachment system has been wired over time. However, when this expected reaction does not occur, when silence replaces pursuit, it creates an internal discomfort that they are not used to facing. Avoidants often use distance as a way to regulate their emotions. Intimacy and emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, triggering a need to retreat in order to regain a sense of control. They believe that by creating space, they can avoid the complexities of emotional entanglement. However, this strategy only works when they can rely on the fact that the other person will always be there when they are ready to return. The moment that expectation is disrupted, they are forced to confront something they usually try to avoid: uncertainty. At first, they may feel relief in the silence, believing that their strategy of pulling away has worked. They may tell themselves that they needed space, that this is what they wanted, and that the lack of response from you is proof that you weren't as attached as they thought. But as more time passes and you still do not reach out, doubt begins to creep in. The certainty they once had about the relationship dynamic starts to erode, and in its place, an unfamiliar feeling begins to take hold: discomfort. This discomfort is critical because avoidants are experts at suppressing emotions, but they are not immune to them. When they expect you to chase and you don't, they begin to question whether they have miscalculated. They wonder why you are not reacting the way they assumed you would. Have you moved on? Are you losing interest? Have they lost control over the situation? This uncertainty can lead to a heightened sense of awareness about their own feelings they have worked hard to suppress. In some cases, this discomfort can trigger an avoidant to reflect on their own behavior. They may start recognizing patterns they hadn't seen before, realizing that their distancing tactics are not without consequence. The absence of contact forces them to sit with their emotions rather than escape them, which can lead to introspection they wouldn't otherwise engage in. They might begin to miss the connection, not because they necessarily need it in the way an anxious attachment style might, but because the loss of it highlights something they were avoiding: their own emotional needs. However, not all avoidants will respond the same way. Some will double down on their avoidance, convincing themselves that the silence confirms their worst fears, that relationships are unreliable, and that distance is the only way to protect themselves. Others may begin to feel a pull toward reconnecting, realizing that the person they expected to always be there is no longer making themselves available. This realization can be jarring because it disrupts their long-held belief that they can control the push-pull dynamic. Regardless of how they react externally, the key takeaway is that silence does not go unnoticed. It forces an avoidant to experience something they rarely allow themselves to feel: uncertainty, emotional discomfort, and the potential loss of something they had taken for granted. Unlike words, which they can rationalize away, or emotional pleas, which they can dismiss as neediness, silence is undeniable. It is an experience, and experiences shape behavior far more than conversations ever could. No contact is not about manipulation. It's about breaking unhealthy cycles and reclaiming emotional balance. Many people misunderstand the purpose of no contact, especially when dealing with avoidant individuals. They see it as a strategy to win someone back, to make them miss them, or to trigger a reaction. But when used with the right mindset, no contact is about self-respect, self-growth, and refusing to engage in a dynamic that is emotionally draining. It is not about punishing the avoidant or trying to force them into a position of longing. Instead, it is about changing the way you respond to their distancing behaviors in a way that benefits you first. When an avoidant pulls away, they are usually trying to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm. They create distance because intimacy and vulnerability feel threatening, even if they desire connection deep down. If you constantly chase after them or try to convince them to stay close, you reinforce the belief that they can always retreat without facing real consequences. They come to expect that someone else will always do the emotional work in the relationship. But when you remove yourself from that cycle, when you no longer take on the role of fixing or saving the connection, you shift the power dynamic, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that allows you to stop sacrificing your emotional well-being for someone who is unwilling or unable to meet you halfway. Avoidants do not respond to pressure. The more you try to talk them into reconnecting, the more they feel the need to create space. This is why many people who deal with avoidance feel like their efforts are never enough, because they are trying to solve an emotional issue with logic, persuasion, or reassurance. But an avoidant doesn't change because they are convinced to. They only begin to reflect when they are faced with something that forces them to challenge their own patterns. And silence is one of the most powerful ways to create that challenge. Choosing no contact is not about hoping that the avoidant suddenly realizes your worth and comes running back. It is about breaking the unconscious habit of overgiving and over-explaining yourself to someone who has built walls to avoid deep emotional involvement. When you remove yourself from that dynamic, you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of trying to earn love and validation from someone who is not emotionally available. Instead, you redirect that energy back to yourself, your own healing, and your own emotional growth. This process can be uncomfortable, especially if you are used to being the one who keeps the connection alive. You may feel an urge to reach out, to check in, or to seek some kind of closure. But closure does not come from someone else. It comes from you deciding that you are no longer willing to participate in a relationship where your needs are not met. It comes from realizing that you deserve a connection that is mutual, where both people are emotionally invested, rather than one where you are constantly proving your worth. When you stop chasing, you send a message, not to manipulate, but to affirm your own boundaries. You show the avoidant that you are not someone who will settle for breadcrumbs. More importantly, you show yourself that you are capable of standing in your power, even in the face of uncertainty. Whether the avoidant eventually reaches out or not becomes irrelevant, because the real goal of no contact is not their response. It is your own transformation. It is about breaking free from cycles that keep you stuck and stepping into a space where your emotional needs come first. Stepping into your power is the ultimate shift that occurs when you embrace no contact, not as a strategy to get someone back, but as a way to reclaim your emotional strength and self-worth. Too often, people dealing with avoidant partners become trapped in a cycle of seeking validation from someone who is unable or unwilling to provide it consistently. They invest their energy into proving their worth, waiting for the avoidant to recognize what they bring to the relationship. But this dynamic only reinforces an unhealthy pattern, one where your sense of security depends on someone who fears emotional closeness. When you make the decision to stop chasing, to stop waiting, and to stop placing your happiness in the hands of someone else, you take back control. This does not mean you stop caring, nor does it mean you stop feeling the loss of the connection. What it does mean is that you no longer allow someone else's emotional avoidance to dictate your self-esteem, your happiness, or your future. It means recognizing that you are worthy of love, consistency, and mutual effort without having to convince someone of your value. Avoidants operate from a place of fear of losing themselves in relationships, fear of intimacy, and fear of emotional dependence. But those who chase avoidance often operate from fear as well. Fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, and fear of losing a connection they have invested in. Breaking free from this cycle requires courage because it means confronting your own fears rather than seeking reassurance from someone who is incapable of providing it. The moment you choose to focus on yourself instead of the avoidant, everything shifts. Instead of anxiously analyzing their behavior, wondering if they will come back, or feeling the need to prove your worth, you redirect that energy toward your own growth. You start prioritizing your own emotional well-being, setting boundaries that protect your peace, and engaging in activities that fulfill you. Instead of waiting for someone to recognize your value, you recognize it within yourself. This shift is powerful because it changes the way you show up in relationships moving forward. When you step into your power, you are no longer drawn to one-sided connections. You no longer tolerate inconsistent affection or emotional unavailability. You realize that love should not feel like an uphill battle where you are the only one fighting to keep the connection alive. For the avoidant, this change does not go unnoticed. They are used to people trying to bridge the gap, to people proving their loyalty despite the distance they create. When they see that you are no longer playing that role, they are forced to reevaluate their own behavior. They may begin to wonder why you are no longer chasing, why you have stopped reaching out, and whether they misjudged your importance in their life. This discomfort can lead to reflection, but more importantly, it shifts the power dynamic from one where you are seeking their validation to one where they must decide whether they are willing to meet you at your level. But the true victory is that their response no longer determines your happiness. Whether they return or not, whether they acknowledge the shift or remain in their old patterns, you have already won. Because you have broken free from the cycle of needing external validation to feel whole. You have stepped into a version of yourself that does not settle for less than what you deserve. And that is the most powerful transformation of all. At the end of the day, understanding avoidance isn't about changing them. It's about changing how you show up in relationships. It's about recognizing that love should not be a one-sided pursuit where you are always the one proving, chasing, and hoping for emotional breadcrumbs. When you break the cycle of chasing, when you allow silence to do the work that words never could, and when you shift your focus back to yourself, you step into a place of power. No contact is not about punishment. It is not about punishment. It is about self-respect. It is about showing yourself that you do not have to beg for love, chase after validation, or prove your worth to someone who is unwilling or unable to meet you halfway. The moment you stop chasing is the moment you set yourself free, and when you operate from that place of freedom, something incredible happens. You attract relationships that are balanced, reciprocal, and fulfilling. You no longer settle for inconsistency because you know that real love is not built on uncertainty. You become the person who sets the standard, and you teach others how to treat you by what you allow and what you walk away from. So if you take one thing away from this, let it be this. Your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to see it. Your value does not decrease just because someone is too afraid to embrace it. The right connection will not require you to chase, convince, or fight for basic emotional security. And the moment you truly understand that, you step into a whole new level of power. Thank you for your time, your energy, and most importantly, for choosing to invest in your own growth. Remember, the most powerful thing you can do in any relationship is to honor yourself first. Stay strong, stay focused, and never settle for anything less than the love and respect you deserve.